Hello and welcome to yet another episode of the MENFINITI Podcast with me, DHIRAJ Singh, your friend, philosopher, and creative guide. Today, we are diving into yet another fascinating topic. Why is it that some of the most creative work happens when there are restrictions and limitations on the mind? What I'm really trying to find out is whether there is a connection between creativity and the lack of resources that boost or encourage creative thought. The short answer to that is yes, there is. You must have heard the saying, necessity is the mother of invention. Let me take that adage further and say that limitation is the mother of creativity. Now, we often think of creativity as this boundless space where ideas randomly grow like mushrooms, or a kind of limitless freedom, a blank canvas where anything is possible. But what if I told you that sometimes having limits, whether it's time, resources, or even rules, can actually make you your most innovative best? Well, let me tell you that we can take that adage further and say that limitation is the mother of creativity. Now, we often think that creativity as this boundless space where ideas randomly grow like mushrooms, or a kind of limitless freedom, a blank canvas where anything is possible. But what if I told you that sometimes having limits, whether it's time or resources or even rules, can actually lead you to your most innovative ideas? That's what we're exploring today. How constraints, blocks, and limitations are there not just to challenge you, but to inspire us to think outside the box. But first, let's try and understand the psychology behind this. Let's start with why constraints, blocks, and limitations actually work. Research in psychology tells us that having boundaries can trigger something called divergent thinking, which is the ability to find creative solutions to a problem within a set framework. I have talked about this divergent thinking in my earlier episode number 1, and J.P. Guilford, the psychologist who came up with that phrase. So do check that one out. So let me explain how divergent thinking works. Let's say, for example, if I handed you a blank page and said, draw something, you might just freeze suddenly, overwhelmed by endless possibilities of what you could or could not do on that paper. But what if I said, draw a picture of a house using only triangles and circles? Suddenly you're brainstorming ways to make it happen. In this scenario, the constraint of having to carry out a very specific task, that is, using only triangles and circles, sparks ideas you might not have thought of otherwise. Get the idea? If not, let me tell you about a famous study that found that people given fewer options were more innovative compared to those with unlimited options. The limitation forced them to get creative with what they had. Now, let's look at some real-life examples of creativity under constraints, blocks, and limitations. Some of the most groundbreaking innovations have come from people working under constraints. Take, for example, the idea of jugaad. It's the Indian art of innovation, often done with whatever stuff is available at hand. We have seen innumerable examples of this, where people in villages have created tools out of scrap material, or even cash-strapped startups finding innovative ways to market their product or service. Limitations often force people to innovate in ways they have never imagined possible. Let's look at some other examples of people who have brilliantly innovated and aced their game with top form creativity. The first name that comes to mind is of Steve Jobs and the original iPhone. When Steve Jobs worked on his first iPhone, he demanded that it have just one single button. If you're thinking, why did he do that? Well, he had very early on in his life understood the principle that creativity happens in tight spaces. So he put the block on himself to see what comes out of that. Besides, he was also big on minimalist design and the ease of using devices. Anyway, that one single button demand pushed his designers and engineers to innovate and think out of the box. And today, that minimalist design is the hallmark of all Apple products. The second name that comes to mind is of Shakespeare. You think, what kind of constraints did he have? Well, in his time, sonnets had to follow a strict 14-line structure with a specific rhyme scheme. The rules made it difficult for many poets to break into the field. But what many could not crack, Shakespeare aced. He wrote some wonderful poetry within those rigid boundaries. Lines that have traveled the world with the English language. Lines like, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate." The third name that comes to mind is what we now call pandemic creativity. During the pandemic, we saw a burst of creative output as people adapted to limited resources, from businesses pivoting online to artists creating music and films from home. The lack of freedom actually fueled innovation. I remember myself when I started cooking like crazy and posted my cooking videos online under a series called Lockdown Chef. Whoa, some of those dishes still make my mouth water. The natural question that comes to mind is, how do we embrace constraints in our own life? Well, it's not that easy, and it doesn't come naturally. But now that we know constraints, blocks, and limitations can drive creativity, we can learn to embrace them rather than running away from them. So here are my 3 tips on how to embrace limitations. Number 1, make your own deadlines. If you're working on a project with no clear deadline, set one for yourself. Shorter timelines can push you to focus and prioritize, which often leads to creative breakthroughs. Number 2, limit your tools. Instead of waiting to have the perfect setup, the perfect machine, or the perfect camera, work with what you've got. Many photographers, for instance, create stunning work using just their smartphones and learning how light falls on faces, objects, and landscapes. And then they use the light at different points of the day to some amazing effects. Number 3, try constraints in creative exercise. Give yourself challenges like writing a story in exactly 100 words or creating a painting using only 3 colors. Constraints like these often push you to innovate in unexpected ways, just like Steve Jobs and his single button rule. I'd love for you to try this. Pick one project you've been procrastinating on for a long time and add a constraint. Maybe it's a time limit or a rule about the tools you can use. See what happens. It might just surprise you. Let me end this one with our own MENFINITI moment. Real stories about creativity and resilience. Today's story comes from a filmmaker who started shooting short films during lockdown with nothing but a smartphone and a desk lamp. These constraints didn't just limit him, they inspired him to think in new ways about lighting, angles, and storytelling. One of his films even won an award at an indie festival. I'm talking about Sean Baker, the director of Tangerine, that he famously shot on an iPhone. This story reminds us that creativity isn't about having everything. It's about making something great with what you have. So before we wrap up, here's a final thought. Constraints, blocks, and limitations aren't obstacles to creativity. They're actually opportunities. They force us to think differently, to innovate, and to find solutions we never would have discovered otherwise. Thank you for joining me on the MENFINITI Podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe and share it with someone who could use a little creative inspiration. And remember, creativity is everywhere. You just have to be open to finding it. Until next time, this is me, DHIRAJ Singh, saying stay creative and stay limitless.